Well, hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Kendra Kimbaraskis, and I'm the Senior Director of the Food, Agriculture, and Rural Economies Program at the State Innovation Exchange, or SIX, which is what we call ourselves for short. I'm also a farmer from Oregon, and I'm really glad to be here with this incredible panel of state legislators. Senator Frazier, Rep. Jones, and Rep. Ager we're all going to be here together to talk about how Southern policymakers are supporting rural communities, farmers, and regional food security. But before I dive in, I just want to take a moment to thank the organizers of SAFSF, Sassafras. This is genuinely one of my favorite events of the year, and I'm always so grateful for the care and attention you put into grounding us in place. And it's such an honor to be here in the Gula Geechee Nation, so thank you for having us. I also want to start out by explaining why I'm standing here instead of Senator Kim Jackson. Senator Jackson is a Georgia state senator and someone I deeply admire, and she was supposed to be your moderator today. But she was called back to the Capitol because the Republican majority was moving to redistrict in the wake of the Supreme Court's Louisiana versus Calais decision. And if you're not familiar with it, that recent ruling gutted the Voting Rights Act's protections against racial gerrymandering, and it sent Republican-controlled states scrambling to redraw maps and eliminate majority black districts. Georgia was prepared to follow suit, and you're going to get a chance to hear from Representative Jones about his experience in Tennessee in just a moment. So the bad news is that Senator Jackson couldn't be here, and she is very sorry. She asked me to convey that, but she had to go to the Capitol. The good news is that Georgia's Republicans backed down because Senator Jackson, her colleagues, and thousands of Georgians made it absolutely clear that they weren't going to stand by while the Republican majority tried to take the state backwards. So, hurrah. So before I ask our panelists to introduce themselves, I want to take a few minutes to talk about what state legislators are up against right now, because it's really important context for everything we're going to be discussing today. State legislators are often the last line of defense against threats to our democracy and personal freedoms. And while many of us first heard about Project 2025 in the context of the last presidential election, legislators, especially in southern states, have been fighting against these ideas for a very long time. So I want to ask you something. When you picture a state legislator in your mind, what picture comes to mind? Is it a nice office in a nice building? Someone in a suit with a team of staff pulling a comfortable salary? That image certainly exists in some states. Some states do operate that way. But for the vast majority of state legislators across the country, the reality looks very, very different. There are 7,386 legislators in the United States. For context, there are just 535 members of Congress. The average salary for a state legislator is $44,000 a year, with many states paying far less. So for example, in New Mexico, which is where this conference was last year, legislators make nothing. It's just a volunteer position. New Hampshire, another state, pays simply a $100 stipend to their legislators. And here in Georgia, the base salary is just $25,000. And yet these people are expected to become experts and make decisions on literally thousands of issues that impact all of our lives. And they're doing so without staff, mostly, with very few resources, and sometimes while working like a second or third job just to pay their own bills. Because of this reality, policymakers tend to rely on whoever they already know in the Capitol when they need help making a decision. And far too often, that's the longest serving lobbyists, and if I can be frank, a lot of these lobbyists do not share our values. So this is where SIX, the organization I work with, comes in. We are a national resource center for state legislators who want to advance progressive policy, but don't always have the capacity to do it alone. We work with about 1,800 legislators across the country, and that's, for context, 1 in 4. And we're working at the intersection of democracy, economic justice, health equity, and agriculture. And we pick up where the electoral work or the campaign ends and where governing begins. And so specifically, our agriculture program is built to support legislators who want to move progressive policy in the rural agriculture and food space. When we first designed this program, we talked to a lot of legislators about what they knew or didn't know about food and agriculture policy, and what we heard was very telling. When it came to ag policy, even our most progressive values-aligned legislators were largely taking direction from the Farm Bureau and the agribusiness lobby. And that was because that was who was in the building and who the majority of legislators had to rely on because they didn't have relationships with advocates and farmers living in impacted community, and many of those folks who are in our movement. Further, legislators didn't have the lived experience with agriculture to bring to committee discussions because they were often 3 to 5 generations removed from farming. If they were placed on ag committees, and this is what really hurt my heart, they were placed on ag committees, it was almost always their last choice. They felt lost, outnumbered, and told to stay in their lane by their conservative, mostly white, mostly male, and landowning colleagues who were eager to be in these committees because they had a very clear agenda of protecting the status quo. So why is this all important? Well, if you remember back to your schoolhouse rock days, everybody remember? I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill. These committees are the first stop committees that our issues have to pass through in order to become law. And if you care about social or racial justice, these are committees where a lot of racist policy is made. And so far too long, we just have not had our people prepared and supported to be in these spaces. So our response at 6 has been to build something called the CROP, which is the Cohort for Rural Opportunity and Prosperity, which is the only nationwide cross-state cohort of state legislators dedicated to agriculture, rural, environmental, and food policy. Through collaborative governance, we are working with rural, urban, and suburban legislators, advocates, farmers, and communities to drive meaningful change at the state level. And we are striving to shift power dynamics from a model of power over to power with, as we're striving to align a movement built on shared responsibility and trust between state legislators, advocates, and impacted communities. We know we'll never outspend the agribusiness lobby. For example, the Union of Concerned Scientists found that $500 million was spent lobbying on the Farm Bill alone between 2019 and 2023, and that doesn't account for all the money that was spent in state capitals across this country. But we believe we can out-organize the lobby by empowering values-aligned legislators to lead and connecting them with farmers, advocates, communities already doing this very hard work. So over the last 6 years, we have built a network of 149 CROP members in 41 states. More than 84 of our CROP members serve on state ag committees, and 23 are in leadership positions. And we are actively recruiting and supporting more to seek these seats because we intend to change who gets to make decisions about the future of food and agriculture in this country at the state level. And so if I can take a moment of facilitator privilege to editorialize. In my job and in my personal life, I have the opportunity to work very closely with farmers and legislators. Some legislators, like Rep. Egger, is both a farmer and a legislator. But I must say there are so many similarities. Like farmers, legislators work long hours with very little pay and no glamour. If they are in the deep minority, like my friends here, they are dealing with a lot of elements that they don't have control over. Yet they really are the unsung heroes who are doing the slogging work. And whether or not you know it, their work is directly impacting your ability to live your life. So I would like to ask some of my favorite legislators and CROP members doing this really important work to take just a few minutes to introduce themselves. And Senator Frazier, I'd like to start with you.
Thank you. Good evening, good afternoon, and thanks for having me here today. I'm Hillman Frazier, and I'm from Jackson, Mississippi. I serve in the state Senate. Mississippi's in the house. Growing up, my folks grew everything. I had 5 sisters. I was the only guy, and my job was to slop the hogs, and also to help pick the vegetables, shelling, all that kind of stuff. But I went on to school and became a lawmaker. So I'm very glad to be here today. So that's what I do. My job is to make laws for the state of Mississippi. I serve in a trifecta. Our legislature has a supermajority of Republicans right now, so we're working under those constraints right now. But our job is to make sure that we do represent you, use the numbers we have more effectively to implement policy that's going to benefit the people that we represent. So I'm glad to be a part of this today.
Thank you. And feel free to clap. Representative Jones.
Good afternoon. My name is Justin Jones, and I come from the afflicted state of Tennessee. I serve as the youngest black lawmaker, and we just recently had a special session in which they dismantled our last remaining black majority district in West Tennessee. Tennessee was the first state after the Louisiana v. Calais decision to break up black political power. And so what we really are facing in the South, and we're glad that you're here in the South, because really what we're facing right now is a new Confederacy. We are facing a reality that if we do not act, we will lose more black lawmakers than any time since the end of Reconstruction. It'll be the largest loss of black political representation since the end of Reconstruction, so what we're facing here is urgent. Before I was a lawmaker, I was a community organizer, and I was arrested 18 times at the same Capitol, where I now have an office. The troopers who took me to jail now have to hold the door open and say, "Welcome, Representative." And so that's the power of the people. I serve as the youngest black lawmaker. My first 3 months in office, I was expelled from the Tennessee House of Representatives for protesting and reinstated 3 days later by my constituents. And the speaker stripped me of all my committees, but kept me on ag, and said that this will be the only committee you can serve on because it has the most racist chairman, who thinks that his gavel is a whip, and he thought that that would be a punishment because I'm the only member of my side of the aisle on that committee. With all these racist old white men who feel like they are plantation owners, and that's what they view agriculture as: power, controlling the land, and beating up on migrants. And so it's been, what I've come to discover, it's been the best place to organize rural and urban coalitions. We've had some wins, which we're going to talk about later on, and thank you for turning on the light. Because there's two ways that change comes about: either they see the light or they feel the fire. And these folks have not seen the light, so it's time to bring the fire in the South. And so for those of you who are not from here, please know that Project 2025 was Tennessee 2024. It was Mississippi 2024. It was Alabama 2024. It was South Carolina 2024. This has been the front line in our fight for democracy. And so I was born in Oakland because my dad traveled. But I say that my ancestors called me back because my great-grandmother told me stories of Cotton Plant, Arkansas, where my ancestors are from, before moving to Memphis, Tennessee. And so it's been a full circle. I came back to go to an HBCU, Fisk University, and my ancestors called me back to stay in Tennessee because the South is the tip of the spear, and if you can change the South, you can change the country. So thank you for being here.
And Rebecca.
Thank you, and certainly hard to follow that up. I am Eric Ager, and thank you to SIX for bringing us all here, and SAFS for putting this all together. We really appreciate all the hard work, because I know it's not easy. I grew up on a dairy farm in the mountains of North Carolina, in the western part of the state, and then after a long Navy career, came back home after retirement and got back to work on the farm. We have we run a primarily meat operation with cows and pigs and chickens and turkeys, and do eggs and have a pretty big spread throughout the Southeast, with lots of partner operations working together to really try to make the regenerative agriculture model work financially, and have had real success in that. Although the meat business and really the farming business, we all know, is a really difficult one. I was elected to the state legislature in 2022. I'm on the ag committee, and I think these two gentlemen had it perfectly said, in that we talk a lot about what happens at the national level, but the gerrymandering and the redistricting that goes on at the state level has a huge impact on the national level that a lot of people just don't ever see. And in North Carolina, we've been doing it for a long time. And in the 2022 election, we had a 7 Democrat, 7 Republican congressional delegation. And then after the Supreme Court flipped and said the legislature could do whatever we want, we went to 10 Republicans and 4 Democrats in one cycle. And that's pretty much the difference in the national environment now, right? The Congress, and that's the difference between Hakeem Jeffries being the speaker and not. And so, I just, the work that goes on in state legislatures is really important. So thank you all.
Thank you. So one thing I wanted to mention, I have a few questions, and we're going to have a conversation up here. But as questions come up for you, please use the Whova app and put your questions directly in there, and we're going to try to leave space and ask those questions at the end of the conversation. So, All right. Okay. So my first question is going to be for Senator Frazier and Representative Jones. The work that you do depends on having legislators in the room who actually understand what's at stake. When you think about the Calais ruling, not in the abstract, but for the communities you serve right now, what do you want the people in this room to understand?
Very good question. I was first employed by the legislature in 1975 by the Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the House that at that time was a farmer, a soybean farmer, and he stood with Ross Barnett, the governor of Mississippi, to deny James Meredith entrance to the University of Mississippi. He was a very proud segregationist back then. So he was the first person I met in 1975 when I went to the Capitol back then. We only had one black member back then in 1975, and that was Robert Clark. He was elected in 1967, and he was elected in 1967 because blacks were given the protection to register and vote back then as a result of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So he was elected in 1967 because of that. But he was one out of 174 members back then in 1975. When I first went there, that body back then was all male and all pale. That's what it was back in 1975. We had a couple of ladies, but they were able to rise their position after their husbands died in office, and they were allowed to serve out the remainder of their term. But Robert Clark was able to get elected because of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But why we didn't have members up until that point in time, I'll tell you why. Back in 1873 in Mississippi, we elected 64 legislators, black legislators, to the Mississippi legislature. That's because after the Emancipation Proclamation, black males were allowed to vote in Mississippi. And black males made Mississippi one of the richest states in the nation. They did that. But once they got their freedom, they were able to vote for the first time. So they became the working majority. The black males did. So that's how they were able to elect 64 black members back then. They also elected the Speaker of the House. The Lieutenant Governor was black back then. So that was very important. We had 3 statewide positions. But voter suppression that we're seeing today started back in Mississippi in 1890 when they said that we have too many blacks serving. We need to limit their influence, their numbers. So they came up with the Mississippi Plan, which was written in the Constitution. And that plan was, in order to vote in Mississippi, you must be able to read, write, and interpret the Constitution, pay a poll tax, and your grandfather must have been a registered voter in this state. So they eliminated most of the blacks from serving and running in Mississippi back then. But our federal courts, like they're doing today, said that the Mississippi Plan was race neutral. It said that those conditions applied to white folks and black folks alike, but we know that it was selectively enforced. 2026, the Calais decision, they're saying you can't use race as a basis to protect or draw legislative lines and Christian lines. You just can't do that. That's the same thought they had back in 1890 in Mississippi when the federal court said that was okay. Our current court has been weakening our protection, Voting Rights Act, because they said they want to get rid of certain folks they don't feel comfortable with. My congressperson right now is Benny Thompson, one of the best congresspersons in the world. He represents the congressional district in the Delta, but he also served as a Homeland Committee chairperson, and also he headed up the June 6th Commission. And because of his work, your president wants to get rid of him. He's number 1 on his list. And he has their disciples in Mississippi saying that we're going to get rid of this terrorist. So they're using this decision to eliminate black participation. They want to go from what we have in 2026 to what they had in 1975 and 1875. So they're trying to take us way back. So that's the impact we're feeling with the Calais decision right now. Here we go again, same song, same story, just a different verse, but it's being implemented right now. So we won't be going back. We're going to fight with all we can to make sure that we retain Congressman Thompson and other black representatives we have on the state level and federal level in Mississippi. So here we go again, but this time around, we're going to take it to the street. We're going to fight with everything we have to make sure that we retain the progress we made so far.
I think one thing we have to recognize is this fight that we're facing right now, because I just want to put it in terms of a visualization for you. In Tennessee, black and brown people make up 25% of the population. Now all 9 of our congressional districts are majority white. And the way that they did that is they connected Memphis, which has 51% black population, broke up that district, that one county, the 3 districts, and now it's connected to majority white districts 300 miles away. That's how they diluted the vote. They did this in Nashville, my district. In Nashville, you drive 30 minutes from one Krispy Kreme in Nashville to the Krispy Kreme in Brentwood. You pass through 5 congressional districts on a 30-minute drive. That's how they split up our power. And so really what we're fighting for is multiracial democracy. And some people will say, you know, what does this have to do? We're talking about elections and democracy with sustainable agriculture. We know that if you don't have representation, you're not going to have resources. There'll be no check on these agencies. There'll be no one to do constituent relations when the USDA does not respond to your constituents. And so what we're facing is a system in which they've taken off the white sheets and put on some black robes. Because that's what the Supreme Court is doing. They're saying that we want to bring back white power in this country. This is not about race neutrality. This is about maintaining white control. Mississippi has a 40% black population. I've been there twice in the past month. We were there for a rally. 7,000 people came out in Jackson at the convention center. 40% black population, they're saying that no, you will have no representation at the federal level. The issue is that white supremacy is insatiable. It's never satisfied. But what I want people to know in other states is that they're starting with us. But if they come for one of us, they're coming for all of us. And so we have to pay attention to what's going on in the South. We've been traveling in solidarity as lawmakers. We were just in Georgia for their special session. Luckily, didn't go forward. We're in Montgomery where we rallied. But we have to have a united front of the United States to take on this new Confederacy. Because if we have any hope of passing all the policies, the brilliant ideas that come up in this conference, we have to have legislatures that are responsive. And so that is what we're facing with Louisiana v. Calais, and I just hope that people recognize the urgency, because so often people pay attention to the battleground states, maybe of my brothers here from North Carolina and Georgia, but they neglect the rest of the South. And you know, Tennessee may not be a swing state, but we're a state that will swing back on you when you kick us. We will fight back with everything that we have. And that's what we're recognizing. And what they're doing in particular right now, because we're going to be reconvened in January, is that they've done the federal maps, and now they're coming after the state maps to break up the black rural districts at the state level. The meager representation that we have, that's what's next. And so we may not be able to sit up here next year as representatives, but you know, one thing that we'll say is that we will use every tool at our disposal. When they passed this map in Tennessee during the special session, I walked off the House floor and I burned a Confederate flag in the Capitol Rotunda, because we had to send a message to them that we will not go back, that we will not go back, that we will not go back, because they're taking us back to a time we don't want to go to.
So my next question, all of you have experience working alongside farmers, food advocates, and rural residents in the legislature. Rep. Ager, can you speak about a specific moment where that kind of partnership made something possible in the legislature that wouldn't have happened otherwise?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's actually multiple examples, and I'll try to talk about one. But, you know, as we all know, working in a legislature that, you know, you're in the minority or the deep minority. I'm used to talking about being in the deep minority, but talking to these guys, I'm not in as deep a minority as they are. So in a lot of ways, very fortunate. But one recent example is that the lobbyists got into our Farm Act in North Carolina in 2025 at the beginning of the session, what's known as the Bayer Bill. Many of you may have heard of it, but it basically gives complete immunity to pesticide companies in court, so that they can't be sued if their pesticides cause healthcare concerns or other dangers in the community. And working across the aisle with folks who are open to ideas about health and community, as well as bringing in huge numbers of people in the community, and farmers who do healthy farming, bringing those huge folks to the Capitol, we were able to get that stripped out in the House, and I'm happy to report that we just had the conference report on that bill come through, which I was very worried was gonna, this provision would reemerge in the conference report, but it did not, because they realized that the people in our communities and the farming community in a big way was opposed to these things, and so that was a real victory, and we have to really celebrate our small victories when we can.
And just to follow up, Rep. Jones, when you're in something called the super minority, right? So you're not controlling the chamber, you don't control the committees, and when this happens, like, how do you use your position when you don't have the power to build power for the communities that you work with?
Yeah, so just one recent update is that after our special session, the Speaker of the House took every Democrat off a committee, so there's not one committee left. So I said I was a member of the Agriculture Committee. I'm not a member of that committee anymore because we all have been stripped of our committees as punishment for protesting. And so we're in a super minority, which means that they can do business without us even being there. They can expel us, which requires a supermajority to do, which they did in 2023. They can call the question, so we're not even allowed to debate legislation, which is often the case. And we cannot get second on our bill. So I had a bill about healthy soils. I had a bill about looking at grants for young farmers. I had a bill about banning gestation crating, a bill about an agricultural worker bill of rights to protect migrant farm workers. And none of those bills were even given a second in committee because they won't allow them to be heard. And we brought witnesses from across the state who came to testify, and the chairman shut down debate. And so what can we do? It seems almost hopeless, but one of the most important lessons that I learned from one of my mentors, her name is Diane Nash, was one of the directors of the Freedom Ride. She said, you can judge the effectiveness of your movement based on the response of your opponents. And so the fact that these folks are so desperate and retaliating shows that we've been effective. What we've been able to do is to say that, they like to call us the minority party. I said, well, I like what they say in England better. We're the opposition party. Our job is to oppose you, to be a speed bump as you try and drive this train over the tracks, off the cliff of our state. And so we've been able to use different metrics of power. Number one thing that I believe that as lawmakers our role is that we have to be organizers, is that we have to hold shadow hearings if they won't let our witnesses be heard. Okay, we'll take over the governor's chamber and we'll have our own hearing here and bring witnesses to testify as to what's happening. We will use direct action, as we had to do during special session. But what we've been able to do is also build unusual coalitions. And so we had the same fight about the pesticides. And when that bill came up, I think I was the only member of our committee to vote against it. And then these Maha moms start saying, well, you are fighting against this, and we are against that too. And these Republican farmers who came up who felt like they were being just shut down. I said, well, this is how we get treated every day, so welcome. Welcome. And not I told you so, but welcome. Because at the end of the day, white supremacy hurts them too. And the thing that, Kendrick Lamar, he has a song, he says, they're not like us. And what makes us different is not just our policy differences, but it's the fact that when we fight, we're fighting for them and their children too. When I got expelled from the legislature, they said, what is your message to your colleagues? I said, I want them to know that I'm fighting for them and their grandchildren too, to be safe from gun violence and school shootings, to have access to clean air and clean water and clean rivers. And that's what makes us different. And so we've been able to build these unusual coalitions and have, when we defeated the pesticide bill, we've been able to pass protections as a super minority to protect our rivers from building a landfill on a former Monsanto site. We've been able to pass legislation, because they didn't read, to support restoring the name of the Cherokee name of a mountain they named after a Confederate, renamed after a Confederate. And so we've seen some wins. But I think what we have to recognize is that not all of our wins are going to be in that chamber, but it's going to be, how do we transform the dynamics on the outside to set the atmosphere to get some of these folks out of office. Fannie Lou Hamer said, move on over, or we'll move on over you, because we're moving on over. And so that's what we're facing right now, and what gives me hope is that each election cycle we're seeing new people step into their power, and more young people running, and more people recognizing that in a state house seat, my election I won with 281 votes my first time running. These are elections that are won with just that small amount. And so if you run and knock doors, you can outwork these folks. And so I think there's hope there. And I think we have to connect in these unusual coalitions more and more. I don't know about your state. In my state, in Tennessee, the farms are getting screwed over by these tariffs. We had 400 family farms close in Tennessee last year. And folks are coming and saying, well, they've cut our contracts with, for our soybeans, with these foreign contracts. They've cut those. The price of fertilizer is going up because of the war in Iran and all these things with Canada, the tariffs. And so, like, this is a pristine opportunity to organize with these folks. And not to be the I told you so party, but to be like, welcome to our coalition. Because at the end of the day, they're coming for all of us. And they've been tricked into believing that when they fight for Confederate monuments, that these white folks believe that they're fighting for them. At the same time, their rural hospitals are closing. At the same time, their farmers are not getting access to resources. At the same time, their public schools are being defunded by these private school vouchers that only serve the wealthy. And so we have to have a rural agrarian populist movement right now. And the greatest example that comes to my head that I've been studying is the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. And I think that is a model to bring us forward in this moment.
Senator Frazier, did you have anything you'd like to add to the question?
Yes, I would like to piggyback on what my colleague just stated. We have to build coalitions because we know that we're going to have common interests going forward. We have to build on those relationships. We do serve in a super minority in our chamber in the Mississippi legislature. But like I said, I was young when I first went there, like my good friend, Representative Justin. But now I'm a senior member there. I also serve on the Rules Committee. I know the IOUs, those members owe me. I want to make sure that we let them know that also. But in terms of coalition building, we have to make sure we understand why we're there. We're there to represent you and understand the power we have. In order to be effective, you have to understand the rules you're playing them under. By playing with the rules, understanding the rules, we've been able to advance legislation, build coalitions, be effective doing that. But like I said, in order to do that, you have to understand that you might be in a disagreement on an issue today, but you're going to find something going to have in common tomorrow, and just build on that. Focus on what you have in common. Build on that and go forward, because like I said, you're going to need them again tomorrow, and the next day they're going to need you. But by building those coalitions, you do that. And also, very important to empower the people you represent. Supply them with information because, like I said, they're going to be here when you're gone. So empower them, educate them so they can be more effective. And also let them know that that is their capital too. Encourage them to be up there every day possible, not only for the general session, but also for the committee meetings. But once they do that, members are going to be very reluctant to vote against their interests, the interests of those constituents. So that's why we have to look at ourselves as being not only legislators, but also educators. Educating our colleagues and also educating our constituents, because once we do that, we can make sure that we're going to have something in place that's going to sustain the progress we've been able to make up to this point.
Amazing, thank you. Okay, so for our next question, Rep. Ager, we'll start with you. Governing from the minority means that your wins can be reversed at the whim of the majority. How do you envision building an inclusive food system in a way that holds regardless of who controls the chamber? And how can funders specifically support the efforts of state legislators working from the minority position?
Yeah, that's a tough question, but I think the reality of it is you have to find policies that are supported across the society and across the political spectrum. And the encouraging thing is that there really are, across the political spectrum, there are people who believe in small farms. There are people who believe in healthy food systems. There are people who believe in making agriculture, keeping agriculture going in rural communities. And if that's not, across the partisan divide, there are real opportunities there. And I think if you build on those opportunities, once you get things into place, it's unlikely that they will be returned. With respect to funders helping to solve these problems, I think, I do think that for one, certainly the sustainable agriculture movement is really outmatched in state legislatures. The Farm Bureau and lots of other, agribusiness lobbyists have the money to have people there in your ear all the time, and there's nobody on the other side of the discussion. And so, I think organizing that lobbying effort, and I fully realize that, it's a little bit scary, I think, in the funder world to get into the sort of dirtiness of politics. I think that's a real fear that a lot of people have, and politics certainly, in some sense has gotten ugly and messy, and it can be tempting to just kind of want to back out of that and not be involved. But the decisions that are made really do matter, and the fact that the other side is not afraid to get their hands a little bit dirty is, means that they tend to win a lot of these arguments. The other piece that I think that funders can really do, the one thing that is more powerful, and this was certainly true in the Bayer bill debate, but in other things as well, is that, lobbyists and people being in the room in your ear is very powerful. The one thing that can beat that is lots of constituents showing up and proving that they have a different opinion. And there's two instances of that. I talked about one of them, but the other is, we had in North Carolina a bill that was going to ban shrimp trawling in some of the inner harbors, and different opinions on that for sure. But the shrimpers, and this was driven by the leadership and by very powerful lobbyists in the Capitol. And when the shrimping community from the coast showed up and drove their trucks around the Capitol for a full day, that bill died. And so, it's not impossible to defeat these really high-powered lobbyists, but it takes organization, and it takes groups that are ready to mobilize and bring people to the discussion, and that we don't often see that in the legislature.
Thank you. Senator Frazier.
Yes, that brings to mind something we did in our legislature. We have to empower the folks to let them know that they do have a voice, and they have to come up there and let us know where they stand. Let me point out two things that we did. When we had the debate about the timber industry, changing the weight limit on trucks that haul timber in our state, some of the timber farmers were very upset because it was going to affect their pocketbook. So we organized them to come to the Capitol in their logging trucks, with logs and all. And that got our legislators' attention, and they backed up from that. In terms of healthy choices, in Mississippi, it was against the law to breastfeed in public. That was disturbing the peace, and you could be arrested for that. But what I did, I organized a lot of the breastfeeding mothers. I brought them to the Capitol with their babies. And they were able to educate this male-dominated body in terms of the importance of our healthy choices. And we have to make sure that we educate our constituents and let them know they can make a difference, because the power rests with them. So organizing them and bringing them to the Capitol will make a very big difference. And also, while I'm on that point, one of the things we have to realize that we have very limited staffs. We have to rely on outside organizations to supply us with very good information. In my state right now, we have a debate going on about solar panel farms and also data centers. Those are basically going on right now. But we're finding out that we have a common interest with a lot of our rural legislators. We coalescing behind those two issues, making sure that we go forward with the right information. We don't need information from people who have a vested interest in the final outcome of those centers. We need independent information. So that's why we rely on the funders to fund organizations to supply us with very credible, objective information so we can make the right decision. So it's very important that you understand what's going on to make sure that we can be more effective. In order to serve you more effectively, we need to be equipped with very good, credible information. So since our legislators don't provide us with adequate staff, we have to depend on these organizations to provide us with expertise we need so we can make the arguments to improve the lot of the people who represent our farmers and also going forward. So we find ourselves coalescing around different issues, but the more victories we have, the easier it becomes to form this coalition going forward. We were very successful on the Bears bill. But like I said, we have to build on that and other issues, because once we do that, they will understand that we have the same interests. We might have on different jerseys, red and blue, but we have the same goal in mind to elevate our people, get them to the goal line. But in order to get to the goal line, we need credible research and information, and that's where the funders can come in, funding these organizations so they can provide us with the resources we need to make the fight for you. So that's what we have to do going forward in our legislature. We have seen success, but we try to make sure we make our numbers count. We don't sit down and count our numbers because right now we have 58 black members in the legislature in Mississippi. But like I said, we have to make those numbers count because we know they're trying to reduce those numbers as a result of the last decision. But if we organize, educate our people, empower them, we don't have to worry about who's sitting in these chairs because the people will make those choices for us, and it will make a difference.
Thank you. Rep. Jones?
You know, I think one of the biggest things we have to continue to do is just to pull off this veil of false power that we're forced to face right now. You know, I serve with folks who literally don't read legislation that they're passing. That's why they don't take questions. That's why they cut off debate. I was sitting on a committee and I was asking about biodiversity. And the chairman said, Representative Jones, you always want to make things about race. We're not talking about DEI. This is the folks we're dealing with. And I had to explain what biodiversity was. And it had nothing to do with DEI. But it's just, we're racist and ignorant. They go hand in hand. And so we need groups who can help us to do the education back in their district, because to be honest with you, at least I'm just speaking for myself and not speaking for an organization, but we may not be able to tell folks who to vote for in the nonprofit world, but we can tell on some folks. We can go back home and tell on folks and hold local accountability campaigns and educate folks of who they are serving. Why is it that the Farm Bureau was up pushing this pesticide immunity bill when their membership back home was against it? Why was it that the Farm Bureau was pushing a bill to remove protections for wetlands when their membership was against it? We need to hold folks accountable back home. And sometimes, the second thing I learned too is that there's power in presence. It means something. As the only member of my side of the aisle on the Ag Committee, I've been showing up in rural counties and trying to be present when these votes come up. And they said, you're the only one from our committee who showed up. I said, I wasn't from Murray County, didn't know about it. But now I've been going there for 2 years now. That's why I bought a horse, because I started riding a horse with these farmers out there, building coalitions, relationships. And so when something happens now, I said, Representative Sapicki, I know your folks back home. Maybe we should call them to come see what you're doing up here. And so we have to, the other instance I remember, sometimes you have to make folks to be unwilling allies and unwilling coalition members. I was the only Democrat to go to RFK, had an event at the Tennessee Capitol, crazy. But I went to go here. And I listened, I took notes, and I used his own notes. I said, okay, you talked about all this healthy stuff. And so I went, and the governor was standing there, and RFK was standing right here. They said, you want to take a picture? I said, I don't want to take a picture. I said, I just have a question. This pesticide immunity bill, it seems to be against everything you just told us about. He said, you're right, I'm against that. I said, did you hear that, Governor? And so using these ways of the power of presence to try and also recognize that there's division amongst their own coalition. A lot of these folks are united in white supremacy, but they don't understand what that means. And there's divisions between the Maha and the more corporate, minded folks. And so we have to find, how do we build these unusual coalitions? And the Black Caucus had a saying, there's no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interest. And our interest is our people. Our interest is building multiracial democracy and multi-generational democracy. And so we do need funders to help with advocacy work, which I think is okay for C3s. Because they have all these C3s. You have the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity. You have ALEC, which is apparently a C3. I don't understand how. You have the Beacon Center up on the Hill every week, forcing through an agenda that is violence toward our communities. And so how do we offer an alternative to that and a proportionate force? We need help, particularly in these non-battleground southern states, because things are only escalating. And there's a saying that a dying mule kicks the hardest, and this mule of white supremacy is losing its hold, and so it's becoming desperate. And the more desperate it gets, the more violent it's going to get. And so we need to stand together. We need to stand united in this moment. And we need resources to go up against their resources, because we do have organized people, but we need to amplify that. And so we need your help But I'm hopeful being here because I know that this room is dangerous to white supremacy, a room that's talking about these things, connecting environmental justice to racial justice, that has indigenous folks, black folks, Latino folks, white allies. Like, this is a room that's dangerous to the folks back home in my state who think that biodiversity is a bad word. And so now's the time to stand together and remind them that all power belongs to the people.
Do you see why these folks are some of my favorite crop members? I think we're going to switch gears now and take some questions. So if you haven't had a chance to put your questions in the Whova app, go ahead and do that. And Maggie, I'll turn it over to you to facilitate those questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rep. Jones, Senator Frazier, and Rep. Ager. We're so happy you're here today. We have a couple questions that have come through the Whova app, and if anyone is dying to ask a question, please just pop it in the app, and I will read it out to our esteemed legislators. We have had one come in so far, and you've kind of addressed it a little bit, but I'm going to pose it, and there's a two-parter. From a legislator's perspective, how can funders better support advocacy, and what are the gaps you're seeing in coalitions fighting for healthier food systems and access? So,
Read it one more time.
absolutely. From a legislator's perspective, how can funders better support advocacy? That's the first part. And what are the gaps you're seeing in coalitions fighting for healthier food systems and access?
Very good question. The fund is going to do a better job of funding these organizations that do research for us, because we have very limited staff in the legislative process. In order to make very good, sound decisions, we need very good, sound research and information from independent organizations, so that's very important. And once they do that, we can educate and empower the members empower our constituents to push for things that's going to benefit the state as a whole. So funding these organizations so they can provide us with quality research is a very, very good first step in terms of addressing that.
And I would just say that, the other thing is that funding kind of has to be long and sustained. And this really pertains to lobbying. And I know for some people that's a very dirty word, and it certainly can be used in dirty ways. But in my view, there's good lobbyists and bad lobbyists. And if you can find ways to support a lobbyist who may have several different clients all in the same sort of vein of sustainable agriculture and in health, I think if you can find good lobbyists who have built relationships over years, but you can't just hire somebody to show up at a Capitol and expect them to get anything done within a year or two, because the way that politics works is relationships. And so folks have got to have built relationships over a number of years in order to be really effective. And I do think that having good lobbyists, and we certainly have a few in the North Carolina legislature who are not living the lavish lifestyles that some lobbyists do, but they are really committed to doing the good work of getting good policy passed, and they are able to really make a difference and getting into those back rooms on the other side of the aisle in a way that does make a difference. It's not the best system, I think we would all agree, but it is kind of the system that we have, and so playing that game is sometimes necessary.
That's it. A lot of these forces that we're facing want to use the South as a testing ground for all these horrible policies and ideas. And one of the things that we've been saying is that we have to use it as a training ground for this rising generation of civil rights activists. We really need to invest in supporting young people to help build infrastructure that's sustainable. One of the things that we're getting ready to do back in my states, for everyone, I think most people here are familiar with Freedom Summer 1964. Where young people came from across the country to Mississippi, to the South, to organize in terms of civic education, voter freedom schools, voter education, but also connecting to the land. That's where Fannie Lou Hamer was a part of that movement. And so we need another Freedom Summer. And so we're hiring young people with our resources who are going to be in some of these rural counties, empowering folks, doing local accountability campaigns, education, deep canvassing, not just canvassing that's transactional where you say go vote for somebody, but talking to people saying what issues matter to you in your community. And what would get you to feel invested in what's going on here right now? And also saying perhaps who are the people who need to be challenging these folks in these counties? Part of going to these districts is to find people who can actually eventually run against some of these horrible folks who are in office and go year after year unchallenged. And so we need to invest in building that infrastructure for the long term, and not in a transactional way, but in a transformational way. And I think that's going to be key, is really uplifting young people. And that's, I think, where, particularly in the South, where we should put a lot of our resources is with these HBCUs, these young people who are looking for ways to channel their frustration, channel their outrage, and how do we channel that into organizing work for their community. So that's just an idea that came to mind.
And also, one final thing. The fighters must realize that the legislative process is not a sprint, it's a marathon. We need more than resources for one session, because you're planting the seed that first session. You have to cultivate it. It's going to take resources to cultivate that. So it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, and you're going to get the results much further at the end of the rainbow. But like I said, fund it and make sure that the funds are used to make sure they educate and empower the people that you're trying to reach.
Fantastic answers, and thank you so much to everyone who are putting a few more questions in our Whoba app. Maybe we have time for one or two more. The next one is, how does climate change get understood or talked about in some of the, quote, unusual alliances that you are able to build across the aisle? What's the messaging that resonates most in rural agrarian communities?
One of the things that I think we have to do is talk to people as in languages that are not elitist or up here. Farmers may not talk about, this degree change in the temperature, but they see drought. They know what's happening in their community. They know what's going on when you try and build a landfill on a river, what that's going to do. And so I think it's about just building those unusual coalitions by finding ways that connect to people, and not saying you're not here to save people, you're not here to be some outside savior, but you're here to be in solidarity, and you're here to recognize that our struggles are intertwined. And so I think it's coming from that place of humility. As we look at climate justice. And even right now, one of the biggest fights in our state, Elon Musk, his Grok AI system is based in Memphis, Tennessee. And so anytime you go through Grok, it's polluting Memphis. Just think about that. And so and they're trying to build these all across, including in rural counties. And now is an opportunity where you're having farmers who are talking about this and how it's going to devastate their land and their waters and take all this power. And so there's an opening there to really build a long-term coalition if we do it the right way. Because I think overwhelmingly, this is the number one issue where I had people calling my office saying, they still think I'm this radical black identity extremist, but they're like, we agree with you on this issue. And so there's an opportunity to organize around this and to really not make it a left versus right, but to make it a top versus bottom fight once again. And there's ways to educate around that because there's a lot of misinformation going on. When we had this Bayer fight in my state, I'm sure your state was the same, they spent hundreds of thousands, if not millions, on billboards. If you went on YouTube, if you went on their advertisements came up saying that if you don't vote for this, you're going to destroy agriculture in your state. And they put billboards about glyphosate, about how it's, we have to protect this because agriculture is going to be destroyed in the South and in Tennessee. And that took funding. And so maybe we need to put billboards in their district saying, this man wants to poison you? And with their picture, we have to be creative. And that's one of the things that I learned about the South is that we are scrappy, we're soulful, and if you give us a little bit, we can do a lot with it. But if you give us a lot, we can defeat these folks. And so we need to invest in that and together, recognize that there are a lot more folks hurting, and they've been taught to blame immigrants, blame trans kids. Their pain is real, but their target is wrong. It's these multinational corporations. I don't know if the multinational corporations are funders too. So if you want to invest, you owe us reparations anyways. But we need funding, and we need to recognize that we have to show people who the opponent is, and it's not your neighbor. It's the folks who are in these rooms. As we're sitting up here, they're also in rooms and suits, strategizing how they're going to disempower our communities. Those are our opponents.
And I'll just say quickly that certainly in many spaces in the legislature, climate change is not a word that's going to get you very far. That's just somehow become a loaded political word, and so difficult to talk about that. But in Western North Carolina, we just had a huge disaster a year and a half ago that people understand the impact of that, and people are beginning to understand how those kind of things are happening more and more often. And that's true, probably more true on the coasts around the South and even the Northeast. But I think, pointing to those, people understand that. They've seen that devastation directly, and that's true for farmers, but really for all communities. And then the other piece of that I think is really beginning to impact communities and people. We've seen it in Florida, but insurance rates and the fact that insurance is sometimes becoming unattainable, that is a problem that is, a real problem that is emerging that worries folks on the other side. And so being able to point to insurance rates and the fact that some people can't get insurance and the need to find a solution for that is a way that you can get at some of these problems.
Excellent. I don't know if we have time for another question. One more question? Okay.
One more question. What are practical ways, says lawyers, but I think we mean legislators, can help lay people push back against unjust policies? I think you've talked about that a little bit as well, but any final elaborations would be great.
Yeah, very quickly. In our state, our state has been attacked by these data centers, but our state, led by the governor, has given these billionaires and millionaires tax dollars to establish centers around the state. So you tell our folks that you're using your tax dollars to fund projects that Elon Musk, a trillionaire, and other billionaires are funding, while you're cutting money for rural hospitals, education, health care, environmental issues. That rings a bell with them. They see that. You have to be very creative, very visual with them so they can understand it down to their level. So we do that to make sure that they understand what's going on, how we are taking our resources that we need for teachers, education, and other issues, and giving those resources to billionaires to build data centers that really wreaking havoc on all of these communities around our state.
One of the things that we're teaching our fellows this summer is just that because we have to have an escalation strategy. So we know we go through information and education, we get all the information, we educate our community. We try to negotiate with these folks in power, but if that does not work, we go to direct action to force them back to the negotiation table. And so we have to teach people, like, what does that look like? In my state, when we got expelled, as well as during the special session, thousands of people turned to our state capitol to bring that fire. And what the speaker responded by doing was he cut off access to the gallery so people could not even sit up there without a ticket given by his office. He had mothers escorted from the committee room for holding up a piece of paper this big. But you could bring assault weapons into the Capitol because this was more dangerous to their fragile power. A sign that said, protect our children, protect our babies. And so, again, that's just confirmation that these actions have power and why they're being so desperate to suppress and censor. But I do believe that we're getting into a point where we have to look at non-cooperation, looking at things, a way to support people, economic withdrawal, because we're facing such dire consequences in a lot of our states, and we're just here to sound the alarm. I know what's happening in Tennessee is coming to your state next. And so, showing up, and the good thing about a state legislature is that you got to fly to Washington, but most of us can drive to our state capitals, unless you live in Alaska, where it's like you got to fly to get there. But if most of our states, you can show up regularly. And I don't know about the other states, but as citizens in our state legislature, at least it's supposed to work this way, you can testify on bills. You can have your testimony added to the record. Your expertise can be used. And most of the time, all we hear from these lobbyists who are saying the exact opposite of what our community needs and wants. And so, showing up, having that power and presence, organizing, being present at the state legislature, and then eventually, if anybody in here has imposter syndrome about running, because we need new folks to run in a nonpartisan way, I'll say that, spend one day at the Capitol and that imposter syndrome will go away.
And I'll just say that accountability matters, right? Accountability matters, and democracy doesn't work if voters don't hold their elected representatives accountable. And we're in a period of time where everybody's paying attention to sort of all these big shiny issues at the national level, and nobody's paying attention to the things that legislators are actually doing in state capitals. And so making sure that those actions that happen in state capitals are much more widely dispersed through a whole number of different ways, I think is really important.
Amazing. Let's give our panel a round of applause. So I'm sorry that we're not able to get to everyone's questions. I will say that Rep. Jones and Senator Frazier will be here for the remainder of the conference. Unfortunately, Rep. Ager has to fly back due to North Carolina's shenanigans in the Capitol. But should you have questions, I'll be around as well, and feel free to reach out, and we'd love to talk to you. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.